name and your occupation, please.
My name's Ian Charles Jennings. The address is 27 Hilda Street, Essendon. I'm the principal consultant with Chiron Aviation Consultants.
And you've prepared a witness statement in these proceedings, have you not?
I have.
And there's quite a lengthy CV attached to your statement. But I ask you to give us the highlights of your experience on aviation matters.
I am an air traffic controller by background. Spent 30 odd years in that function. Worked in Sydney, Darwin, a little place called Gove, which is where they hold the Garma Festival. Melbourne, stint Tasmania, back to Melbourne. Then spent 10 years working with corporate aviation, maintenance planning, and writing operational procedures for flying the aircraft. Did some performance analysis work for aircraft in and out of various airstrips and aerodromes. And
Yes.
for the last 12 years, I've been working as a consultant in the aviation side of it with renewable energy. I've done probably 30 to 35 wind farms in that time around Australia. I've also done tall buildings, some power lines, and some solar farms around Victoria, New South Wales and Western Australia. I was involved with some of the solar farms and the power transmission lines in the Pilbara for the mines.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Jennings. In addition to writing the statement for these proceedings, we write to proceed on the assumption that you wrote the aeronautical impact assessment that was exhibited with the EES's Appendix O.
That is correct.
All right, thank you. Now, Mr. Jennings, I understand you want to take us through your statement briefly. Just be mindful the inquiry's read your statement, but I invite you to take the inquiry through the key matters you wish to draw to their attention.
Okay, one of the first issues is Civil Aviation Safety Authority, in their wisdom, have changed the way they name aerodromes again. With the change of regulations towards the end of 2021, they referred to aerodromes as regulated in accordance with certification of Civil Aviation Safety Regulation 139-030, and an unregulated aerodrome was any other aerodrome. Since then, we've reverted back to referring to them as certified aerodromes and uncertified aerodromes, which they've been known as for all of my time in aviation. So through my report, you'll see the words regulated aerodrome and unregulated. That is interchangeable. Certified and uncertified has exactly the same meaning. Also, there's another point where I refer to a 600-metre radius in section 4. 600-metre radius below or around the aircraft, that has changed to 300 metres. So this is in relation to remaining clear of obstacles.
Can I just be clear on that? Isn't that in section 4 of your statement or section 4 of your report, Mr. Jennings?
In section 4.4 of the statement,
yes,
on the third paragraph, where it says VFR flight must remain at least 500 feet above the tallest obstacle. Within, it says 600-metre radius of the aircraft. That is now a 300-metre radius of the aircraft.
And is that a change brought about as a consequence of these new rules that you were referring to a moment ago?
Correct. That's a recent change in the regulations.
Thank you.
The process I've used to write the AOA and the witness statement basically is to look at the obstacle limitation surfaces, the procedures for air navigation services, aircraft operations, commonly known as PANSOPs, airspace used to protect aerodromes, protect certified aerodromes, and then followed through with overlying air routes, which have the lowest safe altitude, which is published. That lowest safe altitude is exactly as it says. That's how low you can go on that particular air route and know that you are not going to hit an obstacle. Also reviewed an advisory circular 139E-05 version 1, which again is another name change, talking about the obstacles, including wind farms outside the vicinity of a CASA certified aerodrome. And the definition in that and other parts in the regulation is outside the vicinity is outside the obstacle limitation surface, which extends to 15 kilometres from the end of the runway. Inside that obstacle limitation surface, the Civil Aviation Safety Regulations Part 139 aerodromes apply. Outside that line, Part 139 does not apply. There are other parts of the regulations that cover tall structures, the need to report them. So basically, outside an OLS, CASA has, under airports regulations, has no authority. The PANSOPs airspace is designed to protect the instrument approach procedures, and the diagram under section 4.1 basically indicates how that works. You have a published flight path, which I'll deal with later. Below that, you have 500 feet of clear airspace. And then below that, down to ground level, you can have obstacles. So a wind turbine could come up to the bottom part of that diagram to the obstacle height, and it remains outside the PANSOPs airspace. The quick touch on the difference between visual flight rules and instrument flight rules. Visual flight rules, pilot must have a minimum of 5,000 metres forward visibility, have to be clear of cloud, and remain at least 500 feet above the tallest obstacle on the terrain. So in effect, it's flying by looking out the window. Instrument flight rules is the opposite. That is flying when you don't have what's known as visual meteorological conditions. In other words, you don't have the 5K vis. You may be in and out of cloud, or you may be totally in cloud. You then have to fly in accordance with instrument flight rules, which means both the pilot and the aircraft have to be suitably trained, rated, and the aircraft suitably equipped. Flying by instrument flight rules, you must be at least 1,000 feet above the obstacles within certain parameters of your flight path. And that again depends on what sort of equipment you've got on board. The common one now is RMP2, which is 2 miles either side of track. When I first started in aviation, it was 50 miles either side of track. The advent of GPS has made navigation a lot more accurate. There is also a subpart noted in section 4.3 called VFR at night, which is the ability to fly in accordance with the visual flight rules, but do it at night. That is a separate pilot endorsement that requires certain levels of instrumentation in the aircraft, and it also requires a minimum altitude of 1,000 feet above the obstacles. So in effect, they have to fly to the same lowest safe altitudes as IFR aircraft. When they arrive at an aerodrome, a night VFR aircraft cannot descend below the published minimum safe altitude within 3 miles of the aerodrome unless they have the aerodrome in sight. And IFR aircraft use a published instrument approach procedure, and for the case of Warrnambool can come down to 750 feet to the minimum decision altitude before they have to decide that they can see the runway and land, or they need to execute a missed approach, which is power on, climb out, and head back to the holding point to start the whole thing again, or decide to go somewhere else. And instrument approach procedure, if I may share my screen. Where is it? All right, we'll knock the share off there because I can't. What I'm looking for is not coming up.
Is that because you're unable to share? Because I think you need to be enabled to share, or as you actually can't find the thing you'd like to share?
I've found a particular piece I'm looking for, but it doesn't. I don't appear to be able to share it.
I wonder if Ms. Thomas. Oh, there you go. You're in business now. Thanks, Ms. Thomas.
Okay, we'll bring this one up. That's the instrument approach plate for runway 13 at Warrnambool. This is what the pilot has in their documentation. All these lovely 5-letter designators, which can't be confused, are spots. They're global positioning points in the ether. The modern aircraft with flight management systems, GPS, these particular points are programmed into the GPS. So it will take the aircraft to, for example, that point. They'll then fly past the initial approach fix, through the intermediate fix, to the final fix, and to the runway threshold, or the end of the runway. So if you look at it in profile, you come in at 3,300 feet, you go past the intermediate fix, you then commence descent at 3 degrees, which is a standard descent point, down to the minimum decision altitude, which is 750 feet. If you can see the runway, you continue and land. If you can't, you do the missed approach. Now, on this, you have what's known as the 25 nautical mile minimum safe altitude, which for Warrnambool is 3,300 feet. Then you have the 10 nautical mile minimum safe altitude, which is 2,100 feet. So you commence the descent at 3,300 feet. As it stands at the moment, an aircraft could descend to 2,100 feet across that 5-mile stretch and still be clear of obstacles. Once they get past the intermediate fix, you can drop down to 1,700 feet. So these numbers are now programmed into the flight management system. So the aircraft, it's a bit like a car GPS, the aircraft more or less does it itself. So if I just knock off sharing and go back, that's basically an instrument approach procedure. Now, in the analysis I did for the aeronautical impact assessment, the first part of that is an aviation impact statement for Air Services Australia and Department of Defence. I did the analysis on the impact of the wind farm on Warrnambool, Portland and Hamilton aerodromes, being the three within 30 miles of the wind farm boundary. The only one that was impacted is Warrnambool, and as noted in the summary of opinions, the Willatook wind farm's outside the obstacle limitation surface. It's outside or below any lower safe altitude for air routes in the vicinity, and it's outside any PANZOPS airspace for Portland or Hamilton, and it does not impact on any civil or military communications, navigation and surveillance equipment. So that's, there's a major air traffic control communications facility sitting on top of Mount William, another one on Mount Macedon. There's radar sitting on top of Mount Macedon. The nearest ground-based navigation aids at Hamilton, and that's an NDB, far enough non-directional beacon, which is a very early low to mid-frequency radio beacon that's been around since before the Second World War, and they're still used for some training purposes, but most of them around Australia have now been turned off. And then, as it says, the AIS showed that the Willatook wind farm will impact the PANZOPS airspace for the Warrnambool instrument approach procedure for runway 13, which is landing to the southeast. So that's flying in over the wind farm and landing to the southeast. The penetration or the the penetration of the PANZOPS is by about, I think, 11 or 12 metres, 30, 35, 40 feet. But when you're working out a lowest safe altitude or a minimum safe altitude, if the obstacle is 2,001 feet above sea level, the lowest safe altitude becomes 2,000 plus the minimum obstacle clearance of 1,000, so that becomes 3,001 feet. The lowest safe altitude is rounded up to the nearest 100 feet, so that becomes 3,100 feet. It's rounded up for ease of memory for pilots and for accuracy of flying, because most of the time on an altimeter, 100 feet's about as accurate as you can get. So the Willatook wind farm does penetrate the PANZOPS for runway 13 at Warrnambool. To overcome that, the proponent has been in consultation with City of Warrnambool, who are the aerodrome operators, to obtain their support and approval to have that 2,100 foot minimum safe altitude raised to 2,200 feet. That has not occurred yet, but I believe it's still being worked on. The changing of these altitudes happens all the time. It's predominantly an administrative occurrence. When Air Services produce the next set of charts, they can raise that from 2,100 to 2,200, basically typographically. It then gets uploaded into the various flight management systems for aircraft around the world, and safety's restored. It occurs very, very frequently for catering for the built environment, particularly, for example, around Sydney Airport, around Melbourne Airport, around Essendon Airport, three that spring to mind. So that's tall buildings in Melbourne and tall buildings in Sydney. Similarly, I worked on tall buildings in Adelaide and Brisbane. And usually the Pansop's airspace can be changed without needing to completely redesign the instrument approach. So it's a relatively straightforward procedure and relatively common. There is an alternate way of doing it, as noted, and that is to change the height of 5 turbines. So the biggest one is 14 metres, would reduce tip height of one turbine by 14 metres. I've been advised that that's not the easiest way to do things. You can't just sort of shorten the tower by 14 metres. There's a lot of engineering involved. But that is an alternate method of doing it. The wind farm itself, for visual flight rules, wind turbines are big. They're highly visible. I was listening to part of the visual impact work yesterday. They were talking about it being visible for 50 kilometres. Now, the pilot in command of an aircraft flying the visual flight rules has a distinct advantage of these being probably 2,000 to 3,000 feet above sea level. So he's probably 2,500 feet above ground level. If somebody at ground level can see one 50 kilometres away, somebody at 2,500 feet in the air should be able to see it for that distance as well. So they're large, they're conspicuous, and visually they are quite easy to avoid. So the wind farm itself will have virtually no impact on visual flight rules operations at Warrnambool. As far as flying training or any of that goes, that all occurs within 3 to 5 miles of the aerodrome. So it's 8 to about 15 kilometres or 14 kilometres from the aerodrome. So visual flight rules, flying training, activities around the aerodrome are not a great issue. The RPT, regular public transport flights in and out of Warrnambool, the Air Med fixed wing in and out of Warrnambool, various charter flights. There are some couple of little corporate jets, little 6-seater Citation Mustang and 6-seater Embraer Phenom 300 that fly in and out of Warrnambool regularly. They are IFR capable, flown by IFR rated pilots, and generally we'll use the instrument approach procedure. If the weather's fine and there's no low cloud, they may well, as they fly over the top of the aerodrome, revert to visual flight rules and join the circuit area and land. If there's any cloud or if there's marginal visual flight rules, they will track to the start point for the instrument approach. We'll fly the instrument approach procedure and land. Likewise, Helimed 4, which is a Augusta 139 twin-engine helicopter, doing the emergency medical service. It's also set up for rescue work. That is IFR capable, flown by IFR rated crew. They also have the ability to use night vision imaging systems, which means they can fly low level at night, not necessarily in inclement weather. They still need visibility, and they still need to fly in accordance with the limitations of the night vision imaging systems, but it does give them a lot more flexibility in and out of the place. They also know where the wind farms are, where the met masts are, because they're all reported and appear on flight charts and in the flight management system database. Likewise, police air wing, they're basically the same helicopters with the same capabilities. So the wind farms won't have any impact on them. For aerial agricultural applications, the wind farms, to meet recommendations from the Country Fire Authority, the turbines are generally set up at around 300 metres apart. The lower part of the turbine or the rotor diameter is usually around 40 metres above ground level. Aerial agricultural aircraft, even when they're spreading, aren't normally above 25 to 30 metres above ground level. In fact, they're usually down around about 10 metres. Aerial ag aircraft have to fly in accordance with visual flight rules. They also have, they're also highly trained pilots flying quite sophisticated aircraft purpose-built for low-level flying in and out of rough airstrips. They also are very heavily regulated as far as overspray goes for when they're spreading on a property. They have to do it in wind conditions and flight patterns such that the chemicals do not go over the boundary fence. So their ability to fly accurately is very good. They normally spend their time dodging single wire earth return power lines, which are virtually impossible to see, trees, buildings, TV antennas, or a number of other things. So they're quite skilled, and discussions with various aerial ag people over the last 12 years, we're all saying the same thing now. We know a lot more about wind farms and about wind turbines. We can see them, we just fly around them. They are just another obstacle that we don't particularly worry about. We know they're there. We would prefer them set up in straight lines because it makes our job easier. But they're quite happy to fly close to and within wind farms these days. For aerial firefighting, from an aviation perspective, same things apply to aerial ag. They have to be visual flight rules, particularly the single engine air tankers, and the majority of the helicopters. The fixed wing aircraft, the single engine air tankers, do not fly at night. Some helicopters are equipped with night vision equipment and are flying at night, but not all that often. The large air tankers, for example, the New South Wales Rural Fire Service Boeing 737, that has been flown at night. That's using predominantly radar altimeters and night vision equipment, but it's still limited on what they can and can't do at night. The whole notion of flying aerial firefighting is it's just another tool that's used by whoever's in charge of fighting the fire. There are a number of limitations on flying, for example, wind, smoke, visibility, turbulence, known obstacles, and availability and efficacy. For example, in the big fires last year, year before, around the snowy mountains and in that area, nobody flew for 3 days because it was too dangerous. That was in the same period that the Hercules crashed. The 737 tanker, which you got to remember is a 70-ton aircraft, came out of Richmond, flew down to the fire grounds, descended to set up to have a look for a run, got caught in what's known as a pyrocumulonimbus, which is a thunderstorm cloud created by the fire, lost about 3,000 feet in not many seconds, and suffered an uncommanded roll of 40 degrees. They powered on, got out of that, flew back to Richmond and refused to go anywhere for the next 2 days. So aerial firefighting, whilst it is a useful tool, is only that. It is only an additional tool that people can use, or firefighters can use. A quick touch on aviation obstacle lighting. The risk assessment part of the aeronautical impact assessment showed that aviation obstacle lighting is not required at Willatook. To quote a chief pilot for Victorian Air Med fixed wing, he said, when you're in solid cloud, you can't see the lights. When you're not in cloud, you don't need the lights. And when you're in light cloud or mist, they're a nuisance because they flare and affect your night vision and your horizontal acuity. To the best of my knowledge, there is only one wind farm in Victoria that has lights, and that's Berrybank. And that was built on a permit that was originally issued, I think, in about 2008 or 2009. There are a couple of other wind farms, for example, Warborough and Lowell, where lights have been turned off. The other part I conducted was an airstrip review. There are a number of aerial ag airstrips within the wind farm and on the periphery. My assessment of those, and in talking to some aerial ag pilots, particularly field air at Ballarat, they don't see any great issue with not being able to use those airstrips. They normally use mid-size aerial ag aircraft, and they don't see the wind farm as being a great impediment to the use of those strips or to aerial application in the general area. I think that fairly well covers it.
All right, Mr. Jennings, I was going to ask you how much longer you had to go. We're a bit over time, but perhaps if there's one last point you wish to advise the inquiry.
Point, and that's section 6.4 recommendations, and that is to have the 10 nautical mile MSA and the segment MSA for the runway 13 approach at Warrnambool raised to 2,200 feet, and the proponent and myself will continue talking to the aerodrome operator to see if we can achieve that. And at the very end of it, a couple of recommendations for possible permit conditions to accommodate the construction of the Willatook wind farm would be construction of turbines 39, 48, 49, 51 and 54 must not commence until either the minimum safe altitudes have been amended on the instrument approach, or those particular turbines are capped to the relevant heights as laid out in the recommendations.
Thanks, Mr. Jennings. I have no further questions for Mr. Jennings, sir.
Thank you. Just noting that Warrnambool City Council is not a party to the hearing. They are an objector and raised the issue of the aerodrome as one of their reasons. Ms Marshall, do you have questions on behalf of Moyne Shire Council, and about how much time would you need?
Yes, I do, and I imagine I'll be probably half an hour.
Thank you. I note Ms Tannock and Mr Fedder excuse themselves. There's nobody here from the society ask any questions, or any other parties seeking to ask questions. Right. The questions of the IAP will be asked through Member West at the very end. So we'll commence with you, Ms Marshall, when you're ready.
Thank you. Mr Jennings, can you hear and see me?
We can indeed.
Okay, excellent. So I have some introductory questions and then some questions in relation to your report. If I can start just in relation to the nature of the airport. The airport is called the Warrnambool Regional Airport, and it's operated by, owned and operated by Warrnambool City Council, but its actual location is within the Moyne Shire. That's the case, isn't it?
That's correct. Yes, it's certified aerodrome known as Warrnambool and operated by Warrnambool City Council.
Okay, and in terms of its location, it's generally southeast of the Willatook location, and more or less directly south of the Hawkesdale and Woolsthorpe approved facilities. That's the case, isn't it?
To the best of my knowledge, yeah.
Okay.
Hawkesdale and Woolsthorpe, I believe, are in the area and have been approved. Not sure what their status is at the moment, whether they commenced construction or whether they're going through permit amendment work.
Okay, and it's also Ryan's Corner is another wind farm that is to the west of the airport. That's also correct, isn't it?
To the best of my knowledge, yes.
Okay. Now, is it your understanding, I think this is consistent with the evidence that you've given, that the airport is equipped so that aircraft can land and take off from the airport anytime, day or night, and essentially in all weather conditions?
That's correct. There are a few weather conditions that'll stop them, like thunderstorms. Nobody flies near or through a thunderstorm.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it comes back to aircraft types. All aircraft have what's known as a crosswind component. So if the wind's not blowing straight down the runway, but blowing across, if it's too strong across the runway, they won't be able to land because it's outside the operational parameters for the aircraft.
Okay, so I understand you to be saying that there are some exceptions under which the airport would not be able to operate 24/7 in all weather conditions, but that you generally agree with that as a proposition. Is that the case?
In general, if you've got a suitably equipped aircraft, you can come and go any time of the day or night.
Okay, and the airport's development plan indicates or refers to a 2008 industry publication, I think called Airbiz, which estimated that there were approximately 15,000 aircraft movements per annum at the airport in 2008, and that's been a figure that's been adopted consistently in terms of number of aircraft movements since then. Is that consistent with your understanding of the nature of the airport?
Yeah, I don't know what the recent figures are. They've all been affected with COVID as usual. But yeah, I mean, yeah, an aircraft movement, you could have one light aircraft doing some flying training can rack up 30 movements an hour just doing circuits. So that's take off, come around the circuit, touch down, take off again. So numbers of aircraft in and out aren't necessarily an indicator of how many aeroplanes are using the aerodrome. For example, Moorabbin Airport runs on 330,000 movements a year. It happens to be the major training aerodrome in Australia. And most of those, or a good percentage of those movements, probably 60% of them, are just circuit training. So that's just aircraft going round and round in circles, practicing takeoff and landing.
Okay, so are you suggesting that of the 15,000 aircraft movements per annum in the Airbiz publication of 2008 that's referred to in the airport's development plan, that many of those, 60%, I understood you to say, are associated with training? Is that what you're suggesting?
What I'm suggesting is that the number of aircraft movements at an airport is not indicative of the number of aeroplanes using the aerodrome. For example, Sharp Airlines fly in and out of there, I think, 3 times a week these days. They used to do it daily. The number of movements there will be different now because of Helimed 4. They're in and out fairly regularly. So I guess
right,
what I'm saying is that the number of movements is not indicative of the number of aeroplanes that actually use.
Okay. And are you able to tell the panel the number of aircraft that are actually using the airport?
At this stage, no, because it keeps changing. But I do know there's Helimed 4, there's a Citation Mustang, there's an offshore support helicopter based down there. I haven't talked to Terry for a while to see exactly how many aircraft are based down there. There's nearly 8 companies that I know.
Okay. Mr. Jennings, by Terry, do I understand you to be referring to Mr. O'Sullivan from Council, from Warrnambool Council? Is that what you're referring to?
Yes, the aerodrome recorder.
Okay, and am I correct to understand that you're not in a position to be able to give the panel any advice about the number of aircraft flying in and out of Warrnambool Airport on a regular basis?
No, and I would suggest probably the only person that can is Terry O'Sullivan, because he's
Okay.
there at the time. And
All
he
right.
gets the landing fees.
Thanks, Mr. Jennings. It's the case, isn't it, that prior to COVID, there were scheduled airline services that were provided for a number of years at the airport, but that they ceased during the COVID period. Is that right?
It's pretty Sharp Airlines have been in and out there for a while.
I'm sorry, Mr. Jennings, I missed that.
The Sharp Airlines have been operating in and out of Warrnambool for a number of years. They're back operating there again, is my understanding. So, yeah.
So as a regular patient,
Yeah.
Regular passenger
Yeah,
service?
regular passenger service, yes.
Yeah.
So, you know, a Metroliner, which is about a 11-seater aircraft.
Okay. All right. And would you agree with the proposition that the airport is capable of handling much increased capacity over what is currently occurring there, and the development plan for the airport suggests that it would have capacity for handling over 100,000 movements per annum?
An interesting figure, yes. It probably could. With the existing, I'm not sure how well the existing runway would stand up to that number of movements. Again, it's limited on the size of aircraft it can go in and out of the place due to the construction of the runway and the taxiways.
Now, in terms of the nature of the land that's used and occupied by the airport, do you agree with the proposition that it is really, as a consequence of its location, in the Moyne Shire and away from the built-up area of Warrnambool. It's firstly located on a site that is 152 hectares of land, half of which is grazing, and that it's essentially an airport that is surrounded by farming land, with the exception of perhaps one rural residential subdivision that's located within proximity of it.
It's a general understanding of where it is, and I don't know the exact figures of the size of the land. All I know is the length and directions of the runways.
Yeah, but it is, in terms of its location, facility that is located in an area where tall buildings of the kinds that you've described in various CBD locations are not a regular occurrence. That's the case, isn't it?
That is correct, but you do have tall towers of 590 feet to the southwest of the aerodrome. You have a tower that's 312 feet directly south of the end of the runway 31, which is the one landing to the northwest. So there are tall structures around the area.
Okay. Do you agree with the proposition that the airport operates as a helicopter rescue base for Western Victoria for Ambulance Victoria, and it's also used by fixed wing aeromedical flights for Ambulance Victoria and the RFDS Angel flights?
RFDS and Angel Flight are two separate organisations. Yes, it is. It's used for helicopter and fixed wing air ambulance.
Mm-hmm. And the development plan indicates it's also occasionally used for organ donor flights. That's also correct. Is that the case?
Organ donor flights, depending on where and what they're going to. I mean, when I was working in corporate aviation, I was involved with organ donor retrieval stuff, and that included flights to New Zealand, Perth, to Jakarta. So it depends on where you're going and how quickly you need to do it, and what size team you need to take with you. So a lot of organ donor flight stuff is done in corporate jets because they're reasonably fast, but however that does limit where they can and can't land. But also organ donor flights predominantly are in and out of major cities because that's where the hospitals are.
Okay. And I think you've already indicated an understanding that the airport is used also for flight training in conjunction with other airport facilities such as Moorabbin, Ballarat and Bacchus Marsh. Is that your understanding?
That's correct. You can throw in Point Cook as well for RMIT.
Yes, okay, all right. Is it reasonable for the IAP to proceed on the basis that not all, but many of the flight operations that occur in and out of Warrnambool Airport are of benefit to the wider regional community, particularly, but not just the air ambulances?
What do you mean by IAP? For me, that means instrument approach procedure.
The panel.
Right, thank you. Look, there's an airport. People have aeroplanes, they use airports. Airports usually charge landing fees, so it's a source of income. But yeah, it's, you know, it's an asset that is useful. Whether it actually makes money or is cost effective or runs at cost neutral is something you'd have to ask the aerodrome operators. But there are a number, for example, Malakuta not long ago did not recertify the aerodrome because of the cost involved in upgrading the facilities to maintain certification.
There's no suggestion that that's going to happen in relation to the Warrnambool Airport, is there, Mr. Jennings?
I don't know the economics of Warrnambool Airport, but I do know that airports around Australia, quite a number of them have degenerated dramatically because there is no money to carry out required repairs, let alone carry out upgrading.
In this case, Mr. Jennings, would you agree with the proposition that given that the council, in conjunction with the airport, has an approved development plan which is dated October 2021 and looks to undertake works over the forward period out to 5 to 10 years, it's reasonable to think that whilst that might happen, nobody's got a perfect crystal ball. At the moment, you'd have to say that there's no indication that this airport is not a long-term proposition in this regional location, is there?
No, from my personal view, I kind of hope it keeps running. I mean, the more airports we've got around the place, the better. I know that they have recently resurfaced the taxiway areas, and there's been a couple of new hangars built, particularly a nice shiny new one for Helimed 4.
Mm-hmm. All right. The 2021 development plan for the airport also includes an indication that there are daily aircraft movements occurring at the airport that are associated with oil and gas exploration offshore, so that workers are flown to the airport from other locations in Victoria or presumably around Australia, and then taken by helicopter from the airport to the offshore locations. Is that your understanding?
Yes, the can't think of the name of them now, but they operated on Augusta 139, a couple of Augusta 139s, and they have operated a couple of larger Super Puma, which are a 15-seat helicopter, quite big and used in offshore. From what I've seen of the movements in and out of the place, they're either being flown in by corporate jet or they're coming in with on Sharp Airlines.
Okay.
To join the helicopters.
So, Ms. Marshall, can I just ask where you're going with these questions? We're just trying to connect them with the project itself. Just saying, where are you going with this line of questioning?
The proposition that the council is putting is that the airport is a significant regional facility that is there for the long term, that is being significantly invested in by Warrnambool as a regional asset, and it is the wind farm that is the agent of change. I'm happy to move on, but I will come back to these matters in submissions. We could move much more quickly if Mr. Jennings was in a position where he just answered the questions that I'm asking him. I'm not trying to trick him. I'm just asking.
Oh, sure.
Questions.
Just curious, you're going with questions, and there's a number of scenarios. One is the wind energy facility and the airport work harmoniously together, whichever resolution, and one is one changes in response to the other. And I assume that's where you're going with this question, is the agent of change.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. All right. In its submission to the panel, Warrnambool Council notes that it has fielded similar requests from other wind farm developments for changes to the MSA. Are you aware of any of those requests that have been made?
Not directly aware, but I sort of through my contacts and through my work, I know that there's a couple of wind farms that are seeking to amend the size of the turbines, which will require a change to the MSA.
Okay,
One of the
so
wind
let's.
farms that's out there already, which I understand is going for larger turbines,
Okay.
was responsible for having the MSA lifted from 2,000 to 2,100.
Okay, let's break that down. So what you're saying is that there is an existing wind farm that was associated with the increase in the MSA from, was it 2,000 to 2,100? Is that what you just said?
Correct.
Okay, and which wind farm was that?
From memory, that was Hawksdale.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
And you also referred to a proposal for an amendment to a planning permit where there's also another proposal to modify the MSA to 2,300 feet. That's the proposal to amend the permit for Woolsthorpe to increase the turbines to 230 metres at that site, isn't it?
Not involved with that particular wind farm, but that's my understanding, yes.
So when you said you didn't have direct knowledge, but that you'd heard, that's what you're referring to, isn't it?
Correct.
Okay. And so the position is then that you believe that the MSA has already been lifted once to accommodate the Hawksdale wind farm?
That's my understanding, yes.
Okay.
In 2000, it changed to 2,100 about 3 years ago.
Yep. That it then is proposed to be lifted to 2,200 as a consequence of this proposal.
Correct.
And that there's a further request in process to go to 2,300 in respect of an amended proposal at Woolsthorpe. Is that the case?
That is my understanding. But
Okay.
just to clarify what an MSA is, it's a minimum safe altitude. That's the minimum altitude an IFR aircraft can descend to confidently, knowing that they are 1,000 feet above the nearest obstacles in the area. You look at some minimum safe altitudes, 3.5, 4,500 feet, depending on terrain around them. So the MSA itself does not impact on the ability of IFR aircraft to take off and land at the aerodrome. It's just a minimum altitude that they can come down to when they commence the descent, when they commence the instrument approach procedure. So the MSA, if you have a look at Warrnambool, a 25 nautical mile MSA is 3,300. We're only talking about the 10 mile MSA. Now, a lot of aerodromes around the country, the 10 nautical mile MSA is actually higher than the 25 nautical mile MSA. In other parts, the minimum safe altitude is split into sectors. So I guess what I'm saying is that the MSA has absolutely no impact on the ability for IFR aircraft to operate in and out of the aerodrome. Likewise, the wind farm is outside the obstacle limitation surface, which is there generally to provide obstacle-free airspace for VFR aircraft that are taking off and landing. So we're outside all of that. So we're not going to impact on VFR aircraft or IFR aircraft.
Okay, thanks for explaining that, Mr. Jennings. Are you finished?
Just to circumvent the next little bit on the proposal to upgrade Warrnambool Airport, they are limited in how far they can extend the runways. From what I've seen and what I've been told, the north-south, sorry, the 1331 runway, they can extend it to 350 metres before they run out of land. The moment they extend the runway and shift the threshold, which is the end of the runway, the
Sorry, Mr.
procedure has to be.
Sorry, Mr. Jennings, can I stop you there? I'm just wondering what question you're asking, you're answering.
It's just, you're talking about the development plans for the airport. Now, part of that development plan was to extend the runway. What I'm saying is that extending the runway, the Willatook Wind Farm will have no impact on the extension of the runway.
Okay. Mr. Jennings, can I perhaps suggest that what we might do is you might answer my questions rather than the questions that you anticipate I'm going to ask next, or that you wish I was asking you. And we might proceed with a greater degree of speed here. So as I understood that what I was asking you about was the various proposals to increase the MSA, and you'd indicated that you were aware that it had already been changed on one occasion, and that there were at least this and one other request to the council for the approved increase. Are you aware of any other proposals to modify the MSA?
Yes, there's a proposal for Hexham Wind Farm, which, given the size of the turbines they're talking about at the moment, would require an MSA of 2,300 feet.
Okay. What about Mount Fyans or Darlington Wind Farm?
No knowledge of them.
Would you anticipate, given their location, which is sort of northeast of the airport, that there would also be an issue in relation to MSA there?
Depends how close to the airport they are. If they're within 30 nautical miles, yes, it will. Within 30 nautical miles, depending on the height of the land and the height of the turbines they want to use, it could have an impact on the MSA.
Okay, and what about at Ryan's Corner, which is to the west of the airport?
My understanding with Ryan's Corner is it's outside the 30 nautical miles. My understanding is Ryan's Corner is not going to have an impact, but I have not worked on that, so I don't know for sure.
Okay. So as I understand your evidence, you've taken the view that modification of the MSA is an administrative procedure only, that ultimately once the change is made, the consequence of that is in terms of changes to instrumentation or the mapping system that the planes use. Is that your view?
Yeah, that's what it is. As I've said, the minimum MSA is a minimum safe altitude. And if it's changed, that is promulgated. Aviation documentation is updated on an AIRAC cycle every 3 months.
Okay. And in terms of changes to the MSA, is it the case that they need to be made by Air Services Australia?
Air Services Australia are the procedure designer, and they publish the Aeronautical Information publication on behalf of CASA. So yes, that change is made by Air Services.
Okay. And as you've indicated in your report, is it the case that Air Services Australia will only do that where the operator of the airport consents to the change?
The aerodrome operator actually owns the approach. So yes, changes need to be done in conjunction with the aerodrome operator.
Okay. And is there any ability for Air Services Australia to override the view of the council as the operator of the airport in relation to the MSA?
That's an extremely good question. It wouldn't be Air Services, that would come down to Civil Aviation Safety Authority, who are the safety regulator.
Okay, would it be unusual for an MSA to be altered by either CASA or Air Services without the approval of the airport operator?
It has been done where there's been unknown obstacles put in the way. Now, these are often things like microwave towers, which are only 40 to 50 metres tall and aren't often reported. But when the survey, flight tests and aerodrome surveys done, these obstacles come to light. So MSAs need to be changed to ensure safety.
Now, your report indicates that you were involved in you indicate that in section 3.1 of your report that you were part of the consultation between the wind farm and the regional airport reference group regarding what you've described as minor changes to the published instrument approach procedures at the airport. And those consultation meetings occurred in February and March of 2020. Is it those conversations and discussions that resulted in an indication from the airport operator declining to amend the MSA?
That's correct.
Okay. And subsequent to those discussions in February and March 2020.
Sorry, Ms. Marshall. I was taking notes. I didn't hear the response. Can I just get the response, Ms. Jennings? Ms. Jennings, what was your response to the last question?
That is correct. Response.
Okay. And subsequent to those consultations and meetings that occurred in February, March of 2020, have you been involved in further discussions, negotiations, consultations with the regional airport reference group regarding the changes to the MSA?
Not directly. I've worked with the proponent who is working directly with council as the aerodrome operator.
Okay. And the most recent position of the council, the Warrnambool Council as the operator of the airport, is indicated in its submission to the panel, which is dated the 19th of July 2020, in which the council indicates that it's fielding similar requests from other wind farm developments and that it will be responding with a consistent response, being no consent to raise the MSA. Is that your understanding of the current position of the aircraft operator, of the airport operator?
That's the indication I have from their letter dated 19th of July 2022.
Okay, and you've got no reason to believe that the council's going to change its position if it hasn't shifted over the last 2 years, have you, Mr. Jennings?
Not sure what you're driving at there.
Well, you've been working. Can I put the question to you a different way, Mr. Jennings? You've been working now with the council and the operator, the wind farm the airport operator, over a period of more than 2 years, and the council has consistently indicated that they don't consent to a further change to the MSA to accommodate this wind farm or other wind farms. Do you have any reason to believe that it's likely that the council will change its position in relation to that?
This is slightly in crystal ball territory, but councils change every 4 years. Reference groups change regularly, so I really don't see any reason why sometime in the future that the position will not change.
Okay. The council submission, Warrnambool Council submission to the panel also refers to an Air Services Australia trial of a satellite-based augmentation system, which may ultimately mean that the MSAs can be lowered over time. Do you have any information about where that trial is at and what time frame that technology change might be to allow for lowering of the MSAs in the future?
Okay, let's clarify a point here. SBAS will not change the MSA. The MSA is dependent on obstacles. What the SBAS will change is the minimum decision altitude, which is at the end of the approach. Between the start of the approach and the end of the approach, the aircraft has to descend from 3,300 feet to currently 750 feet. The SBAS system, which is a augmentation of the GPS, there's several different varieties of it. All that does is makes the approach path more accurate. Now, probably the ultimate with an SBAS is you could set up an instrument approach that flew between the wind farms, but you would still have an MSA that is 1,000 feet above the tallest turbine.
All right. In terms of assessment of, so as I've understood what you've referred to in your answers to me, you've indicated that there's been proposed changes or changes that have actually occurred in relation to the MSA as a consequence of individual wind farms as they've been either approved or amendments have been sought. Does an accumulation of wind farms or an agglomeration of them in the way that's contemplated in this particular area make any difference in terms of the usability of the airport, or mean that you need to make any particular adjustments to it as a consequence not of structures on one particular wind farm, but the agglomeration of the wind turbines?
No. As I stated earlier, the instrument approach procedures extend out to or working out the MSA, goes out to 30 nautical miles. So that's 25 nautical miles for the MSA and a 5-mile buffer. Likewise, the 10 nautical mile MSA has a 5-mile buffer on it, which is where the Willatook wind farm, the 5 turbines, are actually not inside the 10 nautical mile MSA. They're in the 5-mile buffer from that. The number of wind farms around the place won't have any impact on the use of aerodromes, as far as I can see, because they are all in a position where they have to be clear of the aerodrome. You may require changes to instrument approach procedures. You might require some changes to obstacle limitation surface. You might require, or you definitely will require, notification via the aeronautical information publication for the location and the height of wind turbines. But for the general operation of airports and the general flying around the place, no, they won't. An accumulation won't have any impact.
Okay. Can I ask you some questions in relation to lighting, obstacle lighting at wind farms? You've indicated your understanding that Berrybank requires obstacle lighting. My instructions are that there's also obstacle lighting required at Ryan's Corner. Are you aware of that?
I don't know. I haven't read the permit for Ryan's Corner.
Okay.
My understanding there is that Ryan's Corner is an early permit, probably issued around the same time as Berrybank. But my own view is it won't need lights.
Okay. We've referred already to the Woolsthorpe Amendment application, which is the proposal to increase turbine height at the Woolsthorpe wind farm to 230. If I can share my screen with you, the document that's been provided to the council as part of that amendment application has expressed the view that the wind farm would be classified as a tall structure. Current advisory information is that tall structures should be lit at night and in conditions of poor visibility, that you need to bear in mind the effect that constant lighting can have, that what might be appropriate is to provide for light activation technologies on an as required basis for occasional aeromedical flights, charter flights, and any private aircraft operating into Warrnambool. Is that your opinion in relation to the matter seems to be different? Is there a reason that you would take a different approach to obstacle lighting at Woolsthorpe than you would at the facility that we're dealing with?
Okay. In response to that, I'll ask a question. When was this wind farm approved?
So this is an older wind farm that's been approved, but which is the subject of a current application to amend the permit to increase the size of the height of the turbines to 230 metres, so of the same order as what's proposed. And I understand that this is a document that's been submitted as part of that application.
Okay. I totally disagree with the premise that's been used. Yeah, certainly it's a tall structure, but that doesn't mean it needs lighting, particularly if it's outside the obstacle limitation surface. Now this goes back to a very old, when I first started with this in 2009, 2010 or thereabouts, there was a view that anything above about 40 metres had to have lights on it. that view within CASA has changed dramatically, as evidenced in Advisory Circular AC 139-05, whatever it is, which I can't find right at the instant. But it's on the reporting of tall structures. And it has changed dramatically from what was in the original advisory circular. And basically has gone right away from the notion that tall structures need lights. As I said, talking to the chief pilot of Air Med fixed wing at Essendon and a couple of other IFR pilots, they've said when you're in solid IMC, in other words, you're in cloud, you can't see the lights. When you're in VMC, in other words, you can see where you're going, you don't need them because you can see them. And the interim bit where you're in and out and you're in light cloud or mist, the lights flare and interfere with your horizon definition. So they're not required. Your flying instrument flight rules, you are required to be above the turbines.
Okay. You talked about the visibility of wind turbines and the ability of pilots to see turbines over quite long distances as a consequence of, at least in part, elevation. There is some research that seems to suggest that painting a turbine or a blade black in a turbine has positive effects in terms of a reduction in bird strike associated with wind farms. Would implementation of that kind of mechanism make any difference to any of your conclusions in relation to the visibility of wind turbines from a pilot's perspective?
The point with visibility of them from a pilot's perspective is they've got to have a forward visibility of at least 5,000 metres. It relies on the turbines being a contrasting colour to the background. So, you know, if they're in the middle of a green field and you paint them green, that's interfering with the visibility of them. As for painting one blade black or painting the ends of the blades alternating red and white, I don't know how much impact that would have. I haven't done any reading on that particular part of it.
Okay, thank you. You talked in your evidence in chief about modifications to the MSA happening very regularly, and particularly you described it as occurring around major airports, which are affected by tall buildings in generally CBD locations. Would you agree that modifications of the MSA in a location such as this happen less regularly than might be the case at Melbourne or Sydney Airport or Essendon or other locations which are located in more built-up areas?
Looking at Western Victoria, look, yeah, possibly. I mean, there are a number of airports around Australia that are literally in the middle of nowhere. Some of those are currently undergoing changes to MSAs and instrument approach procedures to accommodate tall structures, for example, mine equipment, wind farms, and a lot of councils around the place are quite in agreement with modifying the MSAs to accommodate the built environment.
All right, no further questions, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Jennings, we're going to take a break until 11:45 and continue on questions from the panel. Thank you. Please, I'll just ask you to mute yourself. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. All right. Mr. Jennings, we'll be pleased to know that would you come back on the screen? Firstly, I want to check you're there, Mr. Jennings. There you are. Thank you. Welcome back. Please know that numerous questions from the panel have been answered, but Member West has further questions to ask. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Are we still good morning? Yes, we are still good morning, Mr. Jennings. How are you?
Good morning.
We didn't actually touch base on meteorological masts. We were on site last week, Monday last week, and we could actually see a couple of met masts, one met mast from different views. However, it did take a fair amount of looking. And I was thinking about this today or yesterday about a met mast would probably be relatively lost in a field of wind turbines as well. So from a visibility point of view, you mentioned a few things about, one of them is having a top third of the mast being of different varying colours. And I don't understand that you were talking about the guy wire attachments to the ground being treated as well. Can you elaborate on those two aspects, please?
Certainly. There's a section 8 in the AIA talks about wind monitoring towers. You talk to low-level certified pilots, aerial ag, rescue pilots, etc. Those endorsed to fly down in the weeds. Met masts are very, very difficult to see. From personal experience in South Australia, I drove right to the base of a met tower, took several photos around the area, and it wasn't until I brought the photos home and blew them up that you could actually see the met mast. So the general recommendations are that the top 1/3 of the met mast is painted alternating red and white, that the outer guy wires have a marker ball or a marker flap up near the top, but also down near the bottom. Aerial ag pilots point out they're flying down no more than sort of 10 metres above the ground. They're looking at their GPS to keep on track. They're looking at where the edge of the area they're spraying is. They're monitoring their height, their wind speed, their ground speed, the amount of chemicals they're displaying or discharging, I should say. And by the time they see a met mast, they are usually fairly close to the outer guy wires at that low level. So their request is that there be marker balls on the lower part of the guy wires as well. And a suggestion's been made on several occasions that the guy wire attachment points at the ground, if possible, be a different colour to the surrounding area, whether that's just a small circle of the ground as opposed to the grass, or whether they're actually painted black like they paint the base around a windsock at an airport, is pretty much up to the person that owns the met mast. The other thing with the met masts is they are all reported as tall structures to the vertical obstacles database. That has their exact location in latitude and longitude, or eastings and northings. It has their height above ground level and their height above sea level, and that's promulgated via the Aeronautical Information publication. And from time to time, it's if it needs to be published quickly, it's published by a notice to airmen, which is a method of promulgating information to pilots reasonably rapidly rather than waiting for a 3-month update of a document. You can put out a NOTAM within half an hour or so. But met masts are difficult to see. And as I've said, anything we can do to make them a bit more visible, let alone letting pilots know exactly where they are.
Would you see any advantage in painting the whole mast variable colours, like you're saying? Or, I mean, the top third I can understand.
Some of the people I've talked to, in particular, chief pilot of a helicopter mustering service in Western Australia, was of the opinion that painting the entire mast alternating colours could be advantageous. Similarly, a pilot of a survey aircraft, that single engine aircraft that usually flew around about 100 feet above the ground, also made the point that perhaps painting the entire mast in alternating colours could be advantageous. But certainly the aero ag guys seem to be pushing the notion of markables on the lower third of the outer guy wires, and if possible, contrasting colour of the anchor point, the external guy wires.
So from a point of view of obstacles, it's just one of the other obstacles in the region, really, isn't it? A met mast.
Yeah, a met mast is just another obstacle, not unlike the poles and the wire for a single wire earth return power line, various radio masts, the occasional TV antenna. The major point for pilots is that they know they're there, or know they exist, and where they are.
So you're talking about ag pilots, survey pilots, mainly are the ones who are going to be looking out for met masts as well as many other things?
Yeah, they're the ones that are authorised to fly below 500 feet above the tallest obstacle. They're authorised literally to fly just above the ground, and they're the ones that are mostly concerned about it. Normal general aviation pilots flying light aircraft are required to be at least 500 feet above the tallest obstacle. So if they know there's a met mast there that's say 160 metres, which is 300 feet, they need to be 350 feet above ground level. They need to be 800 feet above ground level to be the requisite distance above it.
So a normal pilot on VFR wouldn't need to see the mast if they are flying at the correct level.
That's right. The normal general aviation pilots won't be down that low. It's only those that are conducting specialised tasks that'll be down that low.
Just clarifying just a couple of issues. I'll share a screen. I don't know which one I'll share at the moment. Just this one. Can you see the diagram that you pulled up previously, or was in your appendix 0?
Yes, I can say that.
It talks about the actual holding area, which is presumably 30 nautical miles out from Warrnambool.
No, it's actually 15.
15, is that 15, is it? Anyway, that's Willatook there,
Yeah,
and that's the approach for instrument and an instrument approach. Is that right?
That's correct.
So if I was doing in my PA-28 flying in from somewhere, I could join final on a visual rating anywhere down here.
Yes, in actual fact, you'd probably be even further. Well,
I could join Down just about on Warrnambool.
Those couple of towers are Warrnambool Whiskey Mike is the actual runway threshold for 1-3. So you join out probably where Whiskey Bravo Lima Whiskey Foxtrot is, which is about 5 miles from the end of the runway. So
About
anywhere
there.
between there where those 495 and 548 metre feet towers are.
Out there. Yep.
Yeah, there or north of that.
Yep. Over there. Yep. That's if I wanted to, I could do a short final.
I mean, you're still at that point. You're 3.5 miles out from the end of the runway.
So the only reason I'll be worried about MSAs and things like that is if I'm doing an instrument approach.
Correct.
Can I do a visual approach at night time?
Visual approach at night time, you've got to be above the last safe altitude, either calculated or published, to within 3 nautical miles of the aerodrome and have it in sight.
That's right. Yeah, I actually have to know where I am.
Yeah, precisely, and where any tall obstacles are.
So the only restriction really for the penetration of the wind farm into the airspace, MSA, is for instrument approach.
Correct.
From that direction.
That's correct.
If I was approaching using instruments, would I always have to join in on this path?
That's generally accepted is you join an approach at the initial approach fix, which are those 3 out there.
Yep, those 3. Yep.
And then you come in via the intermediate fix, which is
WI.
you're just in there, and then you follow that down. You're on runway centerline, then descending to the missed approach point.
Okay, and you said the penetration was up to 14 meters, or did I get that wrong?
Just one moment.
I can go to
It's actually
this. Is that helpful?
335, 14 metres for turbine 48.
48, and that's the highest.
Yeah.
So that's penetration of 14 meters.
Yep.
If I go over to this, which is the proposal, turbine location, you said, turbine 39, so that's this one here, is
Yep.
penetrating. 48, we just discussed this here, 49, 51 and 54. Seems to be a bit of a spread between these 4 and 39 over here. Is that because of the lie of the land?
That's correct. That's the height of the land that they're on.
Even though the distance between these 39 and 54 or 51 is quite significant from the point of view of maybe 4 kilometres.
I can show you that on my screen.
I'll stop sharing.
If I can remember how to do it. We have Warrnambool aerodrome down there. That's the Willatook wind farm. Those are the 5 turbines. T39's about 89 metres AHD, 54's 99 metres, 48's about 99 metres as well. So they are sitting on higher ground in relation to the rest of them. If we bring in the obstacle limitation surface, that's way down there, well clear. If we bring in the 10 nautical mile MSA, that actually stops also well clear of the wind farm. When you add the 5 nautical mile buffer, it includes that collection of turbines there. So it's not the entire wind farm, it's only those ones there. The rest of them are actually below the MSA. It's only these ones for about 14 metres that require the 100-foot increase in the MSA. So there's the instrument approach procedure. Whiskey Echo, and that's where your holding pattern is. You commence out there at 3,000 feet. You come into, that's where you commence descent from 3,300. So as you can see, you pass the wind farm before you commence descent. These small lines here are actually the buffer zone around, as I showed in the earlier part, the MOC. These are the buffer zones that have got to be MOC. Their clearance there is 500 feet above the turbines. So these 5 turbines penetrate that 500 foot by what's 314's about 100 feet, not even that.
About 56 feet.
Yeah.
And that buffer zone is only there because of the penetration.
That buffer zone, is there to provide a safety area around the actual flight path. For example, if you're in your Citation Mustang, which is a small twin jet, you'll come around and join the approach. You may miss the actual waypoint by a mile or so, dependent on speeds, wind, and various other bits and pieces, ability of the pilot to fly accurately. So they have the buffer zones built in around it to ensure that either side of the track, you've got, in this case, it's about 2.5 miles either side of the track, that you have that safety area.
So the pilot could also fly in from WG over your L in Hawkesdale?
Yep.
Yep,
yeah.
And missed it completely?
Yeah, either of those 3 points where you can just, you join. I mean, if you're coming from up to the north, you'd probably join at Whiskey Echo. If you're coming in from Essendon, you'd probably join at Whiskey Golf as being the commencement point closest to your flight path at the time. If you're coming in from Portland or down that way, or if you're coming in from the rigs, you'd probably join at Whiskey Delta and then fly the approach if you're in the Augusta helicopters coming in from the rigs.
And remind me, what's the altitude of the orange line? That's 330, isn't it?
That one is the 5 mile buffer on the 10 nautical mile MSA. So that section in there is 2,100 feet currently.
Right, so that's what we're talking about. Right.
The other side of that line, it's 3,300 feet.
So if you're, what proportion of aircraft would fly in on instruments, do you think, needing to know the MSAs and think, yeah, MSAs? Yes.
Pilots being pilots, if they can, they'll use visual flight rules because they can tighten up the approach. It's only in inclement weather they'll use the full instrument approach, although from time to time for practice they'll fly the complete approach. Percentage-wise, be hard to say, probably between 10 and 20%, 10 and 15% would actually use the instrument approach. I mean, I've sort of occasionally have a look at flight radar and you'll watch the either the Embraer Phenom or the Citation Mustang heading in at night from Essendon, and he'll fly in via Whiskey Golf and do the complete approach, regardless of the weather.
So I'm just trying to think of and when it comes to changing the approach height from 2100 to 2200, and if Warrnambool Airport didn't want to cooperate and didn't want to change it, and they're the ones who need to agree to change it, the MSAs, is there a way that other authorities could enforce change?
Not being a lawyer and not being completely up on legislation, but at a stretch, I would suggest probably Civil Aviation Safety Authority could step in using their powers under the Civil Aviation Safety Regulations. Whether they would or not, I have no idea. But I would, yeah, I don't know for sure whether it's so Big Brother could step in and enforce it. It's certainly usually done by negotiation.
Yeah, that's right. That's the best outcome. I could keep talking about this all day. I don't have any further questions, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, and I'm sure we're all glad you're not going to speak about it all day, Mr. Member West.
It's not with aviation people. I tend to talk.
Just a few follow-up questions, Mr. Jennings. Don't mind. The Member West asked you a question regarding it would be advantageous to paint the entire mask, and you refer to other people's opinion regarding that. What's your opinion on that matter?
My opinion is that painting the entire mast is probably a very good idea.
Thank you. And just clarifying, is it your evidence that the wind turbines proposed at Willatook, when cumulatively considered with the closest existing wind energy facilities, will not interfere with satellite tracking devices on the plane?
That's been the advice from Air Services, that it won't have any impact on communications, navigation and surveillance for civil aviation, in particular air traffic control. And likewise, Department of Defence have said it won't have any impact on any of their facilities, bearing in mind that they have some that they don't like talking about.
So you're relying on their advice?
Absolutely.
Thank you. And just final question of clarification. There's been discussions about planes need to be above specified height above the turbine heights to avoid obstacles. Were you referring just to planes there? You're referring also helicopters?
Yeah, I mean, an aeroplane is either fixed or rotary wing. They're all aeroplanes. It includes ultralight aircraft, gyrocopters, etc. They're all considered to be aeroplanes. Gliders. They're all covered by Part 91 of Civil Aviation Safety Regulations and various other bits.
So they're all, they'd say, as such, they're required to be well above that height themselves.
Yeah, that is correct. Unless, for example, HeliMed are conducting an operation that requires them to be at low level. And by low level, I mean anywhere from sort of below 100 feet. They are endorsed to fly below the requisite level above obstacles.
Thank you. Can we just pause one moment? I'm just going to stand down one moment. I've just been contacted by one of my members. I'll just turn my camera off for 1 minute. Thank you.
Mr. Jennings, you might just want to mute for a moment, as will I.
Thank you. Apologies for that. Member West I mentioned that he's dropped out, and can we just wait a few minutes? We'll turn to Mr. Power for any re-examination. So we'll just stand down for a couple of minutes. When you see Member West, we can turn our cameras and microphones back on. Thank you. All right, I think we're ready to go. Thank you.
Zoom decided it needed to update its software. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome back. Hi, Mr. Powell. Any re-examination?
Look, really just on one topic, and I was wondering, Mr. Jennings, if you wouldn't mind getting up on your screen. You had a very helpful Google Maps image there. Could I ask you to share that if you are able?
Okay, can you see that?
Yeah, I can, thank you. And could I ask you to zoom right in to turbine, let's start with turbine 48. I'm trying to get a sense of scale between that orange line is the buffer, isn't it? It's the MSA buffer.
That's the 15 kilometres.
Yeah,
Oh,
so
sorry, 15 nautical miles.
yeah, so the distance between T48 and that orange line, roughly. It's 82 meters. Okay, and can I ask you to zoom out? I think the other one I was going to ask you about is T39, which is, I think, to the southwest. Yeah, I might be wrong about that. No, it's T39.
It's T39 there.
Yeah.
And
About
that's
180 meters. Okay, thank you. I have no further questions. That was very interesting.
T39 is only 2 metres, only penetrates by 2 metres.
T39 only penetrates by 2 meters.
Correct.
All right, thank you.
I was wondering if I can just ask another question, Mr. Chair.
I think
I'm fine with that for what that's worth, sir.
I gave one other party an opportunity, so I'll kind of be kind to Member West, and Mr. Powell, you'll have an opportunity to re-examine if you need to.
Yeah, okay. Just a quick one. Mr. Jennings, we talked about firefighting and being around turbines and things like that. Do you have any first-hand experience or anecdotal experience on firefighting around wind farms?
I have some anecdotal experience with aircraft, for example, Warborough wind farm 4 years ago now. I think they actually had the Hercules down there flying between a couple of turbines, but certainly along the very close to the boundary of the Warborough wind farm. And there have been other instances that I've heard of helicopters and fixed wing actually operating within wind farms. I have some certified footage that was provided to the Environment Court in South Australia of 2 air tractor 802s firebombing through between turbines and a wind farm on the ridges north of Adelaide.
No further questions.
Mr. Powell, do you have any re-examination for that question?
Not from me. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Jennings, we do appreciate your time and for exploring the matter of aviation with us today. You may be excused.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Where to from here, Mr. Powell?
So I think we get the afternoon off again. I was hopeful at one point yesterday. My fire witnesses initially said they might be free this afternoon. Then they told me yesterday they weren't free today. So apologies for that, but it might be so that we have another half day tomorrow, depending upon the degree of interest in fire issues, of course. I do intend to, you have our Part A and Part B submissions, which can I assume the inquiry has read or will have read them by next Monday. So what I'd like to do, time permitting, because I don't know how long the transport evidence will take on Monday morning, but just to spend an hour and a half just to focus on 3 or 4 matters, which have been the particular line of inquiry and interest over as we perceive it, at least over the last week and a half, time permitting, of course.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, you mentioned something else, Spell?
No, that's it
No,
from me, sir.
thanks. Just following up from the aviation evidence today, just a couple of footnotes more than anything else.
Yep.
One is there was a reference to age of change today, and we'll be seeking through, I assume it'll be in submission, whether that's something's been referred to specifically through policy or otherwise, some other document, or whether it's a preferred position, and whether it's even relevant if the aerodrome operator has the ability to veto any changes to the MSA. I mean, that will influence whether there is why even consider age of change if that's the case. So just a bit of insight of the minds of the IAP at the moment.
Yeah.
So in that case, I'm sure everyone has things to do. The IAP will meet and discuss some things further, and we'll take advantage of some of that time and spend the afternoon doing other matters as well. Before we close for the day, are there any other procedural matters anyone wishes to raise?
Not from me, sir.
Thank you. Thank you all, and we'll close today at 12:21 and see you at 10 a.m. in the morning. Thank you.
Thank you.